And so the technological march continued, and as it happened, a dozen years after Hiroshima came Sputnik. And a dozen years after Sputnik came the moonwalk. And when I went up to Los Alamos last year, I talked to the head of the public relations, what they call media relations there. And I asked him about Sputnik, and he said, well, I was born the year Sputnik. It didn't have much effect on me. He said, but what really had an effect on me was the moonwalk. I was around 12 years old. And I taped the conversation and I put it verbatim in the book. He said, when I saw the moonwalk on television, and later as I learned more about it, I was just stunned, he said, by what the United States of America had been able to do out there on the ragged edge with enormous obstacles. And then he paused and he said, I don't think technology can solve all problems, but I think technology can solve almost all problems. And I had been for months thinking that it was and is this adulation, this faith, this belief in technology that's one of the key threads of the doomsday society that we live in the context of corporate power, in the context of a lack of democracy, a contempt for democracy as reflected by the policymakers, as embodied in the institutions. And I realized that for the 1960s, the two most awesome achievements of US aerospace and air technology were the moonwalk and the air war that had turned much of Southeast Asia into essentially the equivalent of moon craters. That the dominance capacity of the US technological order was assuming just such a massive leverage over what people saw in terms of even a horizon. And as time went on, personally, I began to do research in the 1970s about nuclear testing and the nuclear fuel cycle. And in 1980, I went to St. George in southern Utah, and I met a woman named Irma Thomas. And at that point, she was 73 years old. She lived in a neighborhood, as you'd imagine, largely Mormon, where a few people smoked cigarettes. And in a one-block radius of her home, she had counted 31 cancer victims. And as the tape recorder rolled, this is what she said. She said, we're not numbers, we're not statistics, we're human beings. They couldn't pay anyone for the loss of a child. I know that, I hope they realize that. And then she said, we accepted all this. It was our government and we accepted it. Well, of course, they've been told there is no danger, don't worry about the fallout, the nuclear testing is actually to protect you. The children, some of the children who later developed leukemia and thyroid cancer, they would go out and, as they were encouraged to do, look for the Russian planes in the sky, but it wasn't the Russian planes that ended up endangering their own lives. And when I was reading from this book a few weeks ago at a bookstore in California during the question and answer session, a woman raised her hand and she said, my son went to Iraq, and after he was there for 384 days, he was killed. She said, what are we going to do to get the news media to tell the public in this country truth about what that war is and what the rationales for the war were? And then she went on to speak, and it was very much like what Irma Thomas had said in 1980. They couldn't pay us for the loss of a child. I hope they realize that. We're not numbers, we're not statistics, we're human beings. But the whole role of the news media and the political apparatus is to treat people as numbers, as expendable widgets. In the early 1980s as it happened, I did some reporting for Pacific News Service and discovered, I went to Amarillo, Texas, where they do the final assembly of nuclear warheads. And I discovered, a long story short, there was a plastic explosive in the Poseidon nuclear submarine missiles that had already been deployed with a substance called LXO9. It was a very volatile, conventional explosive wrapped around the radioactive core. And it was so volatile, half the time in tests it was exploding, dropped a few inches. Clearly a big danger for a dirty bomb explosion. Unfortunately, those missiles were already deployed. It was in Charleston and Holy Loch, Scotland. It was in and out of harbors and seaports and all the rest of it. So I worked on the story, got the data, and the story's about to come out. And I got a call one morning, right before the story went out on the newswire, from a general who I'd interviewed at the Pentagon, and he wanted to call me back, he said, because he wanted to make something very clear so that there would be no ambiguity, because he was worried that people might misunderstand. He said, we are absolutely 100% confident that if those nuclear missiles are fired, the weapons, the warheads will perform absolutely as they were designed to do. So this was what he was concerned about. And I went back and I looked at something that the theologian Thomas Merton had written. He wrote, "It is the sane ones, the well-adapted ones, who can without qualms and without nausea aim the missiles and press the buttons that will initiate the great festival of destruction that they, the sane ones, have prepared." And it raises and re-raises for us, I think, all sorts of questions about those who are the sane ones, those who are in leadership positions. When I went to Baghdad in September of 2002 and then December of that year and January of 2003, each visit was more and more clear that the US was going to launch a massive attack on Iraq. And I would look at people in the street, or look at children and think, will my country bomb you? And of course the answer was yes. And 2 years ago I went to Tehran, and I had very much the same question as I saw people in the streets. One of the interviews that I was lucky enough to be able to do in Tehran was with Mehdi Rafsanjani, who's one of the sons of Hashemi Rafsanjani, the former president of Iran, in that context a moderate, who was running to try to regain his old job, and unfortunately he was not successful compared to who was elected. And so we were having a discussion with Mehdi Rafsanjani, as I may have just mentioned, was one of his dad's campaign managers. And I kind of got on my soapbox at one point and I said, in the United States, from uranium mining to fuel fabrication to nuclear testing to reactors to nuclear waste, all along the nuclear fuel cycle, it's been a disaster in terms of the environment and human health. He said, nuclear power in the United States has been a terrible mistake. And he looked at me and he said, we like your mistakes. And I think the entire way in which the news media and US foreign policy are framed really ignore just how unconvincing it is when US foreign policy and the capacity and willingness to go to war for that matter are based on the message essentially, do as we say, not as we do. We have the right to decide who can do what appropriately. And so we have now this tremendous spin for war on Iran. And a lot of it is based on the idea that they're violating their signed agreements from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, rules have not always been strictly adhered to. Well, that's true, they haven't been strictly adhered to by Iran. There was some secrecy and dissembling, but basically have been in compliance. But, if you magnify and look at, okay, let's say for the sake of discussion, they didn't always follow exactly the rules. Maybe they broke some of the rules now and again of the NPT treaty. Well, the news media of our country almost never mention that 3 very close US allies, Pakistan, Israel, and India, have never violated the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty because they've never signed it. And so when the United States government says that Iran is the threat, is just another instance of the assertion that power, the Pentagon, gives the prerogative to tell countries what they can do and what they can't do without any single standard of human rights, of arms control, however defined, or anything else.